12 most disturbing true road trip. Horror stories from Blue Ridge Parkway. Horror Story Story 1. The gas station without an attendant. I'd been driving for hours, the kind of drive where the road stops feeling like it's moving under you and just becomes a ribbon of grey in your headlights. The Parkway was dead quiet, no other cars in either direction, and I'd been telling myself I could make it to the next town before stopping. But when the fuel gauge dropped low enough for the warning light to blink, I knew I had to take whatever I could find. The next sign I saw was for a gas station, no name, just the word fuel in faded letters with an arrow pointing off the main road. The turnoff was narrow, asphalt cracked and swallowed in places by weeds. It led me down into a small hollow where the station sat like it had been forgotten decades ago. 2 pumps stood under a sagging canopy, the paint flaking in strips. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered and buzzed, casting these pale circles on the pavement like the ground itself was sick. There were no other cars, no sound but the buzz of the lights and the faint rattle of some loose metal siding in the wind. I pulled up to the nearest pump and cut the engine. The air felt heavier here, the kind of stillness that makes you aware of every breath. I got out, swiped my card, and waited for the screen to wake up. It blinked, sputtered through a few numbers, then went black. I frowned and tried again. Same thing, this dull flicker, then nothing. That's when I heard it. Footsteps crunching on gravel. Slow, deliberate. They were coming from behind the building, moving with a rhythm that didn't sound hurried but certain, like they knew exactly where they were going. I turned and called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. The footsteps stopped. Nothing answered. The wind had even gone still. I stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself it was just some worker doing a late-night sweep. But then came the tapping. Light at first, like fingertips against glass, from the direction of the convenience store's front windows. I walked over slowly. The door was locked, the glass so dusty it muted the glow from inside. The shelves beyond looked abandoned, half empty, scattered with boxes. But someone was in there. I saw movement in the back, a tall shape that passed between aisles, too thin, too tall to look right. It stopped near the window, just out of the glow, and the head tilted, sharply, like a bird hearing something in the dirt. My mouth had gone dry. I stepped back, glancing at my car, the only vehicle in sight. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were fresh, dark against the cracked pavement, as if water had been dripping from the person who made them. They led from the side of the building toward me, the prints deep and distinct in the glow of the flickering canopy lights. My gut told me I needed to leave. I backed toward my car, one hand on, my keys, the other gripping the door handle before I even got there. That's when the pumps clicked on by themselves. The handles lifted slightly, hoses swaying as if an unseen hand had just let go. I jumped into my car, slammed the door, and locked it. My headlights caught the wet footprints again, only now there were more circling around my car, fresh enough that I could see droplets falling in some of them. The shape in the store hadn't moved, but I felt it watching me. My hand shook as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared louder than it should have in the stillness, but even over it, I swear, I heard the faint, steady tapping again, this time not on glass, but on metal. I didn't look to see where it was coming from. I tore out of there, tires spitting gravel, and didn't glance in the mirror until I'd put at least a mile between me and that hollow. When I finally did, my stomach dropped. The canopy lights were gone. No glow, no sign the station had ever been there. Just darkness swallowing the bend in the road. And on my windshield, faint in the reflection of the dash, I thought I saw the shape of a handprint, long-fingered, wet, and dripping toward the hood. Story 2. Mile marker 102 at dusk. I'd been on the Parkway since mid-morning, and by the time the mountains around me started swallowing the light, I'd lost track of how far I'd driven. The air felt different, cooler than it should have been for late summer, with that dampness that creeps into your clothes even when it isn't raining. I remember glancing at the dash and thinking I'd make it to the next overlook before stopping. That was just before I passed mile marker 102. The road there was straight for a good stretch, bordered by dark pines that seemed to lean inward. That's when I saw her, a lone figure on the shoulder, her back to me, standing too close to the white line. She was barefoot, her long dress brushing the tops of her ankles, and her hair hung in thick, damp ropes like it hadn't been dry in days. Something about the stillness of her made my hands tighten on the wheel. I slowed, figuring maybe she'd broken down or gotten lost. She didn't turn when I pulled up, just stepped into the road like she hadn't heard me. Her movements were stiff, like each step was being pulled out of her, but she kept walking directly toward my lane. I stopped a few yards away, the engine idling. I leaned toward the passenger window to call out, and in the time it took me to blink, she was there, standing inches from the glass. Her face was pale enough to make her eyes seem like shadows. Her lips moved, whispering something I couldn't make out over the hum of my engine, but the rhythm of her mouth was deliberate, almost like she was repeating the same short phrase. I reached for the window controls without thinking, but before I could, the door locks clicked. All of them, one by one, like fingers moving along the inside of the car. That sound jolted me in a way I can't explain. I slammed my foot on the gas, not looking to see if she'd moved. The car lurched forward hard enough to make my seatbelt bite into my shoulder. My eyes stayed on the yellow lines ahead, but every reflective road sign I passed, every single one, caught something in its shine. A pale shape in the shadows at the edge of the road just behind my car. At first, I thought it was my mind replaying her image, like when you stare at a light and still see it when you close your eyes. But it kept happening. A glance in the mirror showed nothing behind me. Yet the next curve would flash her shape in the metal of a guardrail or the glass of a mile marker. Always the same posture, always just out of reach. I tried the radio, thinking noise would help, but every station was nothing but static. I left it on anyway, the hiss filling the space in a way that felt safer than silence. Still, the air in the car felt heavier, like I'd rolled up the windows against something thick and pressing in. My hands had gone cold on the wheel. It wasn't until I hit a stretch of road with no signs, no reflective surfaces at all, that I started to breathe easier. I told myself it had been a trick of the light. The moment I thought that, I saw her again, this time in the passenger side mirror, closer than she'd ever been, not moving, just there. The whispering started again, but now I could hear the faint edges of it. A single word, repeated in a voice that didn't sound like it belonged in the open air. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down when I passed the next overlook. The Parkway felt endless. Every turn a repeat of the last. By the time I finally reached a small gas station in the valley, the sky was black and my legs shook when I stepped out of the car. I walked inside, just wanting to be around people, and the man behind the counter glanced up at me. His eyes shifted toward the glass doors, then back to me. "Where'd you come from?" he asked. I told him the Parkway, southbound. He stared for a moment, then said quietly, "Mile marker 102's been shut down for years. Landslide took the shoulder. Nobody walks there." I didn't have the energy to argue, but later, when I went back to my car, I noticed the passenger door lock was still popped up, and in the thin layer of dust on the outside of the window, there was the faint outline of lips. Story 3. The van that matched mine. Late fall on the Blue Ridge has a way of making everything feel older than it is. The trees along the Parkway were stripped bare, their branches like black veins against a flat grey sky. The air had that sharpness that creeps through your clothes, the kind that makes the inside of your nose sting. My old green van rattled along the empty road, heater fighting to keep up, and I remember thinking I hadn't seen another car in at least an hour. Out there, with no sound but the hum of the tires and the occasional gust of wind, you start to feel like you've slipped out of the world a little. It was somewhere between two nameless overlooks when I caught movement in my rearview mirror. Another van. Same shade of green as mine. Same model, even the same awkward dent along the side door, like it had been hit and never quite repaired. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks. Just a trick of reflection or distance, but it stayed there, holding the same space between us, never getting closer, never falling back. I tapped the brakes a few times just to see. It slowed too, matching me exactly. My hands were gripping the wheel tighter than they needed to. I figured maybe I'd let it pass, so I pulled into the next overlook, gravel crunching under my tires. The place was deserted, save for a picnic table half swallowed by weeds. I parked near the entrance and waited. The van rolled in a few seconds later, gliding to the far end of the lot. Its headlights clicked off. Through my mirror, I could just make out its shape. A shadow of my own vehicle sitting perfectly still. I kept the engine running, telling myself maybe they just wanted a break too. But the longer I sat there, the heavier the cold felt, like it was settling into the van's metal. The other driver never got out. I couldn't see a face through the windshield. After maybe 5 minutes, my nerves got the better of me. I eased back onto the Parkway. The van didn't move. For a few miles, I thought I'd left it behind, and my shoulders started to loosen. But as the sun slipped lower, I caught it again. Not in my rear view this time, but in the side mirror, just inches off my bumper. No headlights. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach knot. The license plate. It wasn't just similar, it was the same as mine. Same numbers, same fading county tag. I stared at it for too long, almost drifting over the center line before jerking the wheel back. My chest felt tight. I sped up. It stayed right there. The Parkway dipped and curved, and I pushed the van harder than I should have, the tires whining in protest. When I finally dared to glance again, it was gone. No van in the mirror, no sign of it in the road behind me. The relief was sharp, almost dizzying. I kept driving, thinking maybe I'd imagined more of it than I realized. Then I came to a long, winding stretch with nothing but guardrail on one side and forest on the other. As I rounded the bend, my side mirror caught something, metal glinting through the trees, keeping pace just beyond the edge of the road. My speed didn't matter. Every time I turned my head, there was nothing there. But the moment my eyes went back to the mirror, the green shape slid back into view, perfectly matching mine. By the time I reached the next pull-off, my pulse was pounding in my ears. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I just kept going until I saw the faint lights of a small town in the distance. When I finally pulled into a grocery store lot, I stayed in the van with the engine running, watching the road I'd come from. Nothing followed me in, but when I stepped out to stretch my legs, I noticed a damp handprint on the rear door of my van that I'd been driving the whole time. The fingers were too long, and the palm was angled wrong, like someone had been standing behind me, walking close enough to touch the metal, mile after mile. Story 4. The Man at the Overlook Fence. The sun had dropped low enough that the mountains were more shadow than shape, their ridgelines layered in bands of deepening blue. I'd been driving for hours and needed to stretch my legs, so when I saw the small sign for an overlook, I pulled in without thinking. The gravel crunched under my tires, echoing louder than it should have in the empty space. The place was quiet, too quiet. The only sound was the wind slipping through the tall grass and the faint tick of my engine cooling. I stepped out, the air cool against my face, and walked toward the wooden fence that edged the overlook. The view was wide and endless, but the light was fading fast, swallowing the valleys below in shadow. That's when I saw him. He was at the far end of the fence, maybe 30 feet away, standing perfectly still. His back was almost straight enough to look unnatural, his hands resting lightly on the rail. But he wasn't looking at the view. He was looking directly at me. I felt it before I truly saw it. The way his head was angled, the way his eyes locked on mine the moment I turned. I tried a nod, a small acknowledgement. He didn't move, no change in his face, no flicker of recognition. His clothes were strange, faded trousers held with suspenders, a collared shirt buttoned all the way to the top, and a flat cap pulled low. The kind of clothes you'd see in an old family photo tucked in a drawer. The air between us felt heavy, like sound wouldn't travel right if I tried to speak. My plan had been to take a minute to breathe before getting back on the road, but suddenly every instinct I had told me to leave. I turned slowly, walking back toward my van, my boots crunching the gravel. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine. Slow, steady, deliberate. The sound carried in the stillness, each step matching the pace of my own, but closing the distance. I didn't want to turn. Some part of me knew I shouldn't. I kept my eyes on the van, my fingers already curling around the handle. The footsteps grew louder until they stopped just behind me. The air felt warmer, like someone was leaning close, and I swear I could feel breath at the back of my neck, hot against the cool evening air. My pulse was hammering in my ears as I yanked the door open and slid inside, slamming it shut hard enough to rattle the glass. I hit the locks and started the engine in one motion. My headlights swept across the overlook as I backed up, but there was nothing there, just the fence and the dark shapes of the mountains beyond. No sign of the man, no movement in the grass. I pulled onto the Parkway faster than I should have, the steering wheel slick in my hands. My breathing didn't even out until the overlook was far behind me. Still, for the next 10 miles, I kept catching myself glancing in the mirror. I didn't see anyone following, but that night, when I stopped at a small roadside motel, I parked under the single, flickering light in the lot. As I stepped out, I noticed the thin dust on the back window of my van had been smudged in one spot, right where you'd expect someone's face to press if they'd been standing there, just looking in. Story 5. The car that wouldn't pass. It was late enough that the road between the two mountain towns felt like it belonged to me alone. The kind of darkness you get out there isn't like in the city. It's thick, like the night has weight to it, pressing in against the glass. The Parkway was narrow, curving in long, slow arcs, with only the occasional faded reflector catching my headlights. I was already thinking about how empty my gas tank was getting when a pair of headlights appeared in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. It's not unusual to see another car eventually, even that late. But they kept their distance, always there, never gaining, never fading away. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Whenever the road straightened enough for them to pass, they didn't. They just hung back, matching my speed exactly. I figured maybe I was being too cautious on the curves, so I pulled over at a gravel pull-off, rolled down my window and waved them by. The car slowed and pulled in behind me, not next to me, behind me. Its headlights stayed on, bright enough that I could just make out the vague outline of the car's hood, but not the driver. I waited, so did they. The cold started seeping in, so I put my car back in gear and eased onto the road again. They followed, keeping the same measured distance. The mountain curves seemed longer now, more winding, My eyes kept flicking to the mirror, but I never caught a glimpse of a face, just the blinding beams. Then, somewhere past a bend that cut through a patch of bare poplars, the headlights were gone. Not dimmed, not turned off. Gone. There were no driveways, no side roads, just solid trees and rock. I sat up straighter, scanning both sides of the road, but there was nowhere they could have gone. I tried to tell myself they'd turned around without me noticing, that I just missed it. A few minutes later, my headlights lit up a car ahead of me. Same shape, same color. It was moving slowly, way too slow for that stretch. My chest tightened when I realized it was them. The same car. I knew by the dents in the rear bumper, by the way one of the taillights was dimmer than the other. They didn't speed up. It was like they were daring me to pass. The road was clear, no traffic for miles, so I pulled into the oncoming lane. As I passed, I turned my head, and my stomach dropped. The driver's seat was empty, no one in the passenger seat either. I didn't slow down. I pushed the gas harder, watching the car shrink in the mirror. But after the next curve, the headlights appeared again. Not far behind, not rushing to catch up. Just there, following. When I reached the outskirts of the next town, I pulled into a gas station that was still lit. The car didn't follow me in. I waited for a while, leaning on the hood, scanning the road. Nothing came by. But when I went to pump gas, I noticed something that made my hands shake. My rear bumper, dusty from the drive, had 2 clear handprints on it, one on each side, as if something had been holding on the entire time. Story 6. Static on the Parkway. The Parkway at night can make you feel like you've fallen off the map. No headlights coming the other way, no glow from houses through the trees. Just your own reflection faint in the windshield and the steady hum of the tires. I'd been driving for hours with the radio as my only company, flipping between country stations and static. Most of the signals were weak, fading in and out like they were being pulled through water. Still, it was better than the silence. Somewhere past mile marker 80, the road dipped into a long stretch of forest, so dense it blotted out the stars. That's when I saw the mouth of a tunnel ahead, the kind carved straight through the mountain. My radio was tuned to some old country ballad when, halfway into the tunnel, it cut out entirely. No static, just pure, heavy silence. I was about to switch the station when I heard it. My name. Not sung, not broadcast, whispered, low, like it was being said from the other side of the speaker. I froze, my hand hovering over the dial. Then the voice spoke again, still in that almost too close whisper, and it told me exactly what I was wearing. Word for word, the flannel shirt, the faded jeans, the scuffed brown boots. The hair on my arms stood on end. I gripped the wheel tighter, telling myself it had to be some strange broadcast, maybe a prank. But then it described my car, the make, the color, even the dent on the passenger side door. I felt my throat go dry when it told me what I'd eaten earlier that night. Grilled cheese and tomato soup at a diner 2 towns back. I hadn't told anyone. The parking lot had been empty when I left. I reached forward and switched the radio off. The soft click should have been the end of it. But the voice didn't stop. It kept talking, its tone slow, deliberate. Only now, it wasn't coming from the dash. It was behind me. I didn't turn. Every instinct screamed at me not to. My eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead as the voice went on, the words low but clear. It told me the exact moment my hands had started to shake on the steering wheel. It told me to keep driving straight, not to take the next turn. And then, almost conversationally, it described the back of my neck, the way it looked, the way the skin shifted when I swallowed. My mouth went so dry, it hurt. I pushed the gas harder, the van groaning in protest as I came out of the tunnel and back into open darkness. The trees on either side blurred, my headlights catching their trunks in brief flashes. I didn't dare check the mirror. The voice grew quieter, almost as if it were leaning back, but it never stopped. It spoke about things I didn't understand, places I'd never been, names I didn't know. Then, in the same calm tone, it told me I was going to see something up ahead, and that I shouldn't stop for it. A minute later, I saw it, a figure standing in the road just past the curve. At first I thought it was a deer, but as I drew closer, I could see it was a person. Tall, thin, head slightly bowed. My hands tightened on the wheel. The voice behind me repeated itself, this time firmer. Don't stop. I didn't. I swerved just enough to pass, my headlights glancing over a pale face and still hands. The figure didn't move, didn't look at me, but as I went by, I felt the van rock slightly, like something had brushed against it. The voice stopped after that. Just gone. I drove another 20 miles in silence before pulling into a gas station on the edge of a small town. My legs were unsteady when I stepped out, and I caught myself glancing into the back seat through the window. Empty. I went inside, just needing to be around someone, and bought a coffee I didn't even drink. When I came back out, there was something new on my rear bumper. A fresh handprint smeared in dust, the fingers long enough to reach almost halfway up the back door. Story 7. The rest stop with no exits. I'd been holding it for the better part of an hour, counting the mile markers and hoping for some sign of civilization. When the glow of a rest stop finally appeared around a bend, it felt like a blessing. The place was small, just a cracked asphalt lot with 2 squat brick buildings and a faded vending machine humming under a dim light. Only one other car was there. A dusty old station wagon with all 4 doors hanging open. Its seats were empty, though I could see the outlines of things piled inside. Crumpled maps, a stack of mismatched blankets, and something shiny resting on the dashboard. I pulled into the spot nearest the bathroom building, killed the engine, and stepped out into air that was colder than it had any right to be for early fall. The place was so quiet that my own footsteps sounded too loud. Even the insects seemed to keep their distance. As I passed the station wagon, I glanced inside. There was a faint smell, metallic mixed with something faintly sweet that I didn't like. No movement, no sign of anyone. The bathroom door was propped open, and I stepped inside expecting the usual cracked tiles and graffiti. Instead, it was spotless. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed faintly, reflecting off gleaming fixtures. The air smelled faintly of bleach, and the only sound was the slow, irregular drip of water from one of the sinks. The stillness made me uneasy, like the room had been cleaned too recently, too thoroughly, for such an out-of-the-way place. I finished quickly and was halfway to the door when I realized I couldn't hear anything outside, not the hum of the vending machine, not the occasional gust of wind, not even my car engine cooling. Stepping out into the lot, the first thing I noticed was that the station wagon was gone. Every door shut, the whole car vanished. Then my stomach sank. My own car was gone too, or at least I thought it was, until I saw another one parked in the same spot. Same make, same color, same faint dent on the back bumper. For a moment I told myself I was overreacting, that maybe it was just my car and my eyes were playing tricks. I walked over, keys in hand, but when I tried them in the door, they didn't fit. That's when I saw it. Hanging neatly over the driver's seat was a jacket I'd never seen before. It was heavy canvas, dark green, the kind that looks like it's been through years of rain. There was something stuffed in the pocket, stretching the fabric. Something about the size of a fist. I felt the urge to look, but the air in that moment felt wrong, like I was being watched too closely. I stepped back, scanning the lot. No cars on the road, no sound of tires in the distance. The vending machine was dark now, its hum gone. and the light above it seemed dimmer than before. I thought about going back inside the bathroom, but the idea of stepping into that sterile quiet again made my chest tighten. Then I noticed movement at the far end of the lot, just at the tree line. A shape, low to the ground, slipping between the shadows of the pines. It didn't move like an animal. I stood frozen until it disappeared into the dark, and that's when I heard the faint sound of a car door closing. The copy of my car was still there, but the driver's door was now shut. The jacket was gone. I didn't wait to see more. I ran toward the road, hoping I'd spot headlights, but the parkway stretched empty in both directions. The rest stoplights behind me flickered once, then went out completely. I kept walking until I reached a bend and saw another set of headlights in the distance. Relief flooded me until the shape of the vehicle came into focus. It was the same dusty station wagon rolling slowly toward me with all four doors open, just like before. I stepped into the trees and didn't move until it passed. When I finally made it to the next town and found a motel, I locked the door and checked the lot from my window. Parked 2 spaces from my room was a car identical to mine. Same dent, same paint. I almost convinced myself it was mine until I saw the dark green jacket hanging inside. Story 8. Fog at Raven's Hollow Bridge. The fog that night didn't move the way fog should. It didn't drift or break apart. It just hung there, heavy and still, swallowing the parkway until the world felt no bigger than the faint beam of my headlights. The road ahead disappeared into it, and even my own engine sounded muted, like I was driving underwater. By the time I reached the sign for Raven's Hollow Bridge, my knuckles were white on the wheel. I'd crossed it before in daylight, just another narrow span over a shallow, rocky creek, but in that fog, the edges of it felt wrong. I slowed to a crawl as the bridge came into view. That's when I saw the figure, dead center on the span, leaning against the railing. The shoulders were slumped, the head bowed low under a hood. My first thought was that someone's car had broken down and they were waiting for help. I rolled to a stop a few yards away and leaned out the window to call out. The figure straightened, turning its head slowly toward me. I couldn't see the face in the shadow of the hood, but there was something unsettling about the way it moved, too smooth, like it had been thinking about it for a long time before deciding to look. Then it lifted one arm and pointed at the water below. It wasn't a casual gesture. The arm stayed rigid, the hand steady, like whatever it wanted me to see was still there, waiting. Against my better judgment, I put the van in park and stepped out. The air was damp and cold, the boards under my boots creaking in a way that carried too far in the silence. I started toward the figure. The bridge felt longer than I remembered. The space between me and the figure didn't seem to close, even though I could hear my own footsteps echoing off the rails. Every few paces I glanced back at my van, but the fog had already swallowed its headlights. The pointing hand never wavered. When I was close enough to speak without shouting, I asked if they were all right. No answer, just that steady arm and the slow rise and fall of their breathing under the hood. I stepped closer still, enough to see past them to the railing. The creek below wasn't moving. It should have been rushing after the rain earlier that evening, but the water looked flat, like glass. Then, for just a second, I thought I saw something beneath the surface, a pale shape drifting slowly, almost like it was floating upward instead of sinking. I blinked, and it was gone. When I turned back, the figure was no longer pointing. The arm had fallen to their side, and the hooded head was tilted slightly, like they were listening for something. The fog pressed in thicker, and the air felt heavy in my lungs. I took a step back toward my van. I didn't remember closing my eyes, but suddenly I was sitting in the driver's seat, hands resting on the steering wheel. The engine was off. My breath fogged the inside of the glass, and when I wiped it away with my sleeve, I saw the bridge in the rear view. Mirror, empty. No figure, no movement, just boards vanishing into the white. The keys were still in the ignition, but they were cold to the touch, like they'd been left sitting outside in the night air. I turned them, and the van started without protest. I drove on, but every so often I caught myself glancing in the mirror. The fog held tight to the road behind me, and I kept thinking I could see the faint outline of someone leaning over the railing again, waiting for another car to come by. When I finally made it to the next town, I pulled into a gas station just to stand under the bright fluorescent lights for a while. It was only then, as I walked around to check the van, that I noticed something on the passenger side mirror. A single wet handprint, the fingers long and thin, smeared toward the door, like someone had been holding on as I crossed. Story 9. The Hitchhiker in the Rain. The rain that night didn't fall so much as lean on the car, a steady weight that pushed the world into a smear of water and glass. I'd been on that stretch of road longer than I meant to be, the kind of two-lane that threads the spine of the mountains with no shoulder worth naming and no houses close enough to throw a light. The wipers beat a tired rhythm and the heater blew damp air that smelled like old leaves caught in the vents, and I told myself I'd make the next town before stopping, until the headlights caught a man on the right side of the road, walking with his thumb out. He was already more shadow than person in the downpour, hunched into a raincoat that glistened the way heavy plastic does, the kind you wear for work more than for weather. I drove past him a car length before guilt and a twinge of something older clicked my blinker on. I eased over, let the engine idle, and reached across to pop the passenger lock. He opened the door without a word and slid in like he'd rehearsed it 1,000 times. Water came with him, puddling fast on the floor mat, and the smell of his coat was faintly chemical, like wood smoke mixed with something that had burned wrong a long time ago. He stared straight ahead, the brim of his hood angled down so I never saw more than the wet line of his jaw. I said where I was headed, said I could drop him in town, asked if he was all right. The things you say when a stranger is suddenly close enough to feel their cold in the air. He didn't answer, he didn't fidget. He just folded his hands, pale and still, and settled against the seat like the road belonged to him too. I told myself maybe he was embarrassed. Maybe his voice was gone from the rain. Maybe I'd be him one day and need someone to stop. The mountains rose and sank in the dark beyond the glass, the fen of kudzu and pine slick and mute, and the rain pressed harder until the lines on the road blurred and I had to lean forward to make sure the car was still where I put it. He breathed shallow, like someone trying not to take up space in a sick room, and every now and then the wet coat crackled at his elbow when we hit a dip. The heater struggled against the cold he'd carried in. I remembered the radio and twisted the knob until a station came in half right, a thin voice singing about a house with a blue door and no one inside to open it. I turned it down, then off. The only sound left was the two of us not speaking and the water knifing across the windshield like an unending string of beads. When my eyes got heavy and the curve of the road pulled my focus inward, I glanced over to check he hadn't fallen asleep. If he did, I thought I'd wake him gently when we hit town, ask his name then, tell him I grew up not far from these hills, that we're supposed to look out for our own. The passenger seat was empty. His raincoat sat slumped, still dripping, the hood falling into itself as if it missed. The weight of a head, the shock went through me like cold electricity. I reached out and touched the coat. It was heavy and slick and colder than the inside air by a good distance. I jerked my hand back, half ready to slam on the brakes, half ready to pretend I hadn't seen anything at all. I told myself he must have slipped into the back to lie down, that the coat had fallen where he'd been. Without turning around, I called out, said hey, asked if he was okay back there, voice higher than it had been a second before. The only reply was the rain. I checked the mirror and caught nothing but black glass and the ghost of my own face. I kept driving like the choice was keeping the car between the lines, or letting something I didn't want to name crawl up into the front seat with the storm. A minute later, the smell in the car changed. Less smoke, more like soaked ashes, like a campfire someone had drowned and kicked apart with boots. It filled my mouth and climbed into my nose until I could almost taste the grit of it. I told myself stories then, the way you do when you're pinned between fear and the need to be reasonable. Maybe he'd asked to be let out, and I hadn't heard him over the storm, and he'd slipped away at a turn. Maybe I'd stopped without noticing, and he'd gone back into the trees. Maybe the coat had always been there, and I was overtired enough to misremember my own kindness. But the floor mat gleamed where his shoes had been. Water trailed from the door seam to the seat and down, small rivers finding the same path over and over. And in the fogged shape the coat's hood left against the window, I could make out the faint arc of a breath mark, long and slow, as if the glass had caught him when I hadn't been looking. The next town was still 10 miles out. I counted them down aloud, mile by mile, so I'd have something human to answer, and each mile the coat bled a little more water, like it had a reservoir nowhere near done. When the road flattened and the trees gave way to a stretch of dark pasture, the rain thinned to a hard mist. My shoulders dropped. I took the first lit exit I saw and pulled into a car wash bay to get out of the weather, the kind that's open all night and eats quarters and floods the ground with a light bright enough to make your nerves feel seen. I put the car in park but left the engine running and finally turned to look into the back. The seat was empty, but the fabric was darker in a single long strip, like something had lain there soaking through from its spine. There was ash scattered in a thin line across the floor, the kind you get when you knock a log the wrong way with a poker and don't sweep carefully. I told myself I could explain that too, maybe from the soles of my boots, some old stove back at the cabin, 1,000 small ways life lingers where it shouldn't. I stepped out under the light with the raincoat bunched in my hands to shake it free of water before I left it on a chair in the bay. When I did, something soft slid from the inside pocket and fell to the wet concrete with a sound too gentle for how heavy it looked. It was a postcard, edges singed, a photograph of a view I knew, mountains layered blue, a date rubber stamped in a corner from a summer long gone. On the back, smeared but still legible, a sentence. Made it to town, headed home by night. The name beneath it was unfamiliar. The postmark was from a place up the road I hadn't reached yet. I put the card back where I'd found it and set the coat over the chair. It sagged in a way that made me think of a person sitting down after too long on their feet. When I got back behind the wheel, the smell of wet ash had already settled into the seats. I drove the last miles with the window cracked, even though the rain angled in, and when I pulled into the diner on the edge of town, I kept the engine idling while I stared at the glass door. A dark shape stood just inside, a man about my age with a hood pushed back and water pooling at his feet, waiting for someone. The bell didn't ring when I went in. No one was there but the waitress filling salt shakers and the jukebox whispering to itself. I ate anyway, because eating is a kind of prayer. When I came back out, the coat was gone from the chair in the bay, and a wet handprint had bloomed on the outside of my passenger window. 5 long fingers splayed, trailing rain, as if someone had leaned in to look at me one last time before walking back into the night. I drove home smelling like smoke that wasn't mine and watched the shoulder for miles, not to pick anyone up, but to make sure the road had given them back. Story 10. The Carved Tree at the Curve. The road that night was a ribbon cutting through hills that had known my family longer than I have, the way the Blue Ridge holds memory like a creek bed holds silt. I'd been driving alone, trying to shave time off a trip that shouldn't have happened so late, cursing my own stubbornness with every curve that leaned the car toward the guardrail. You don't plan on stopping in those places where the map is just green and the radio is just static. You keep going, that's the rule. but I came around a tight right-hand bend where the asphalt slumps inward, where the pines are thinned by old wind, and saw the oak. It was colossal, older than the road, older than the county markers, its roots shouldering up the earth like knuckles. In the sweep of my headlights I saw something carved deep into the trunk, letters bright as bone where the bark had been cut away. I didn't want to stop. I stopped anyway. When I killed the engine, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt listening. I stepped out, the night wrapped in the smell of leaf rot and that metallic damp that comes before a storm. The oak's bark was ridged and dark, scarred by lightning somewhere in its past. I lifted my phone to use the flashlight, but the battery icon glared red and then went black, like it was embarrassed for me, so I used the car's low beams and walked up to the trunk. The cut letters were unmistakable, my initials. The date under them was today's, clean and exact, the kind of careful numbers you make when you're sure you'll want to remember. The first dumb thought that came was that someone was messing with me, but the wood at the cuts wasn't just fresh, it was warm. Not like sun heat, not that surface toast you get at noon. Deeper than that. I set my palm there and felt the warmth go into my hand the way a dog's breath does. Somehow personal. I pulled back and wiped my palm on my jeans as if it had left something on me. The curve was blind. If a car came fast, it would throw its lights across the trunk the way mine had. I told myself I'd get a photo and be gone. The second I leaned closer, something shifted above me in the leaves. Not wind, not animal, but the slight creak you hear when someone leans nearer over a banister to listen. The thought made my teeth press together before I could stop them. I took another step back, trying to see the branches, trying to insist with my eyes that there was nothing there. That was when I heard it. My name in my voice. The way it sounds when a recording plays back and you hate how thin it is. It fell from the canopy so exactly like me that my body didn't doubt before my mind did. It said, soft and urgent, keep driving, don't stop again. I'd like to say I ran right back to the car. I didn't. I froze and stood there feeling the old part of me, hill blood, churchyard common sense, shake awake and put a hand on my shoulder. The leaves didn't move. The branches didn't move. But something in the crown had the patience of a person in it, and my own voice had come down from there like it had been waiting for the right second to be believed. I forced myself to step forward and place my hand against my initials again, because touching something is a way of making the world agree to be ordinary. The heat under the bark throbbed once, slow as a heartbeat, and in that same slow rhythm, the word keep came again. The syllable worn like a river stone, spoken in the exact shape of my mouth. The smell of the tree shifted, sweeter, a cut stem aroma that made me think of church flowers in summer and a wooden pew that holds warmth hours after anyone sat there. The road behind me made its own sound, far-off tires you feel before you hear them, the way mountains pass sound like gossip along their ribs. I glanced that way and saw no light yet, just the dark dressing itself over the ditch and the guardrail. I thought of how the initials were set at a height I wouldn't have chosen, higher as if carved by someone tall or someone standing on something. I thought of how precise my handwriting could be when I wanted it and how these letters were that kind of precise. I looked for a ladder, a stump, any sign of a thing dragged near, and saw nothing. On the other side of the trunk, in the uneven shadow, the ridges of the bark made a pattern that, for a treacherous second, looked like another set of letters, with my last name trying to find its way out of the chaos. When my eyes adjusted, it was only the tree being a tree again. The tires came closer, enough that I could tell they belonged to a truck pulling weight. Pride or stupidity or both made me lift a hand instinctively to warn them. Slow here, it's a bad bend, watch the oak. And then the headlights slid across me like a hand turns over pages. For a breath, my shadow surged up the trunk, and my initials glowed bone white. The truck didn't slow. It roared through with the kind of purposeful speed that makes you imagine every phone call that's waiting at the end of it. The draft tugged at my jacket. The oak held steady. The warmth of the carved letters pushed once more into my palm, like the tree were a mother startled by a door slam and then telling you, "Hush. It's all right. Don't make it worse by talking." When the darkness knitted back together, my car looked wrong. I couldn't say how. It was the same shape where I'd left it. The same faint smear on the rear quarter panel where dust never seems to rinse away, but I suddenly didn't trust it. I told myself to get in, lock the doors, drive until a diner appeared and let fluorescent lights scrape the fear off me. I told myself to wait until morning to decide what a carved tree had to do with my memory. I took one step, then two, and then the branches above me whispered again. Not my name this time, not even words. A sound like a low prayer when everyone else has stopped speaking. The murmur you hear from the one person still not done. I looked up. For the first time, the leaves trembled, not from wind. They twitched, as if something breathed through them and the tree had leaned to accommodate it. I don't remember deciding to run. I was in the car with the door shut and the key turning and the engine catching like it had missed me. The headlights grabbed the trunk one more time, and in that flat light, the cuts seemed deeper than before, the edges seeping that living dark that raw wood gets. I put the car in gear. From the branches came my voice again, closer now, irritated the way I sound when I repeat myself. Keep driving. It wasn't a warning anymore. It was instruction. I obeyed. The road unrolled. I wanted music and found only hiss. Every reflector that flashed back at me looked like a pair of small eyes set into a mile marker, and I imagined they were counting me, marking every time I chose not to stop after this. The sky held its rein like it was thinking about me. A deer stood on the verge at one point and never moved as I passed, its ribs laddering its side, its gaze fixed at the level of my window as if it had been instructed to watch for a face. The word keep threaded through my head until it didn't sound like English, just a pressure behind my teeth. At the next turnout, I slowed, not to stop, just to breathe, and saw another oak across the ditch on the bank, smaller, storm-gnarled, its trunk holding a bright oval where bark had been cut away. It was too far for my lights to do more than confirm shine, but in the wet air, I thought I could smell it again, the green sweetness of fresh carve. I pressed the gas. The car shuddered at the seam in the pavement, and the sound that came from somewhere behind the dash was small and unhappily like a second voice clearing a throat. In the corner of the windshield, a pale smear showed where my hand had pressed earlier against the first oak and then against the glass without thinking. 5 prints, pollen fine, like a child's stamp. I didn't stop again that night. I drove into a town that always looks shut, even when it isn't, and I sat in the lot of a closed laundromat with the engine off and the hood ticking and the smell of green wood still soft in the vents. My phone woke up enough to throw a dim light, and I opened the camera without taking a picture, holding the blank circle over my own face to watch myself breathe. In the reflection on the windshield, the dark hill behind me looked like another trunk with a pale oval cut into it, and for a moment I had the childish feeling that if I turned the key, the car would speak in my voice from the vents and tell me to keep going, keep going, keep going, because something patient and taller than me had already carved today into the world and warmed the letters with a heat I had no business touching. I left the keys in my lap and watched the glass until dawn thinned it. And when I finally put the car in gear, I didn't look at the hills, and I didn't touch any trees, and I tried not to think about how certain that first voice had been that I shouldn't stop again. Story 11. The motel that wasn't there. I'd been blinking hard for the last 30 miles. The kind of blinking you do to keep the road from slipping like a ribbon under your eyelids. The Parkway at night is 2 narrow bands of grey and 1,000 feet of dark on either side. Just the whine of your tires and the occasional reflector flashing back like an eye. I kept telling myself to make it to the next town, to the next 30 minutes, to the next song. But there's a point where the wheel feels warm under your palms, and the heater's breath gets too soft, and you know you're choosing between a bed and a ditch. When the red vacancy sign appeared through the trees, hanging crooked over a gravel lot like a jewel, I didn't question why it was there. I flicked my blinker and turned down the narrow drive, stones rattling up into the wheel wells. It was an old motor court, a 1-story row of doors with green trim, each with a diamond-shaped key tag hanging on a peg inside the office window, numbers written in a faded hand. The office looked like someone had set out to make it smell like clean pine and never stopped. There was a cut branch in a jar, a pine-scented plug in the outlet, a broom leaning against a counter polished to a dull shine. A bell tinkled when I pushed the door open. The clerk stepped out from a back room without a word. Early 60s, I guessed, with a thin face and a tie as old as the place. He looked at me like he was waiting for the line I was supposed to say. I said I needed a room for the night. He nodded once, slid an old register toward me, and set a pen on it that didn't work until I pressed hard enough to indent the paper below. He didn't ask for a card, didn't ask for a name, just palmed a key with a green tag. 12. The lot was so quiet I could hear the ice machine humming somewhere behind the rooms, that soft, steady churn. My door creaked the way old doors do when the wood's swollen from years of weather. Inside, the room was cleaner than I expected. 2 twin beds with quilts scrubbed to the color of old photographs, a small table with a Bible and a map of the Parkway folded to show the next 50 miles, a TV that looked like it would eat a coat hanger for an antenna. The air smelled of pine sol and dust that had been chased but never caught. Somebody had stood there earlier with a rag and care, I could tell. It felt like walking into a place that had been paused, and I was the pressure that made it resume. I set the key on the table and sat on the edge of the nearer bed. The mattress gave with a tired sigh. Through the wall, something ticked, a baseboard heater finding its rhythm. I peeled off my boots and lined them toe to heel, the way my father taught me in cabins with mice, and sat there listening to the dark. No cars passed. The sign outside made a soft neon buzz that barely lifted into the room. I told myself I'd shower in the morning and only planned to rest my eyes. The last thing I remember clearly was the map's fold like a river canyon under my hand, and the smell of pine, clean but sorrowful, like Christmas long after the tree has browned. Something woke me that wasn't sound. It was the absence of it. The heater had stopped. The hum of the ice machine was gone. The neon's buzz had pulled its needle from the thread. I opened my eyes into a darkness that felt closer than it should have. My back ached the way it does when you sleep in your clothes. I reached for the bedside lamp, and my hand brushed cold glass. Not a lamp, a window. My fingers froze against it the way they stick to metal in winter. The glass was beaded with moisture, the cold coming through in a way no motel window would allow in a kept room. I pushed myself upright too fast, and the seatbelt bit my shoulder. I was in my car. The steering wheel a black moon in front of me, the dash lights dead. My knees were pressed up against the glove box with the kind of familiarity I would have sworn I hadn't felt in hours. The doors were locked. Outside, the side of the road shouldered into a patch of gravel just big enough for a tired person to surrender to. There was no building, no row of green-trimmed doors, no office with a cut branch in water. The woods pressed close where the motel had been, pines standing like thin men, and the only light was the pallid wash off the clouds. I sat, completely still, waiting for some memory to catch up. Me deciding the place looked wrong and pulling back onto the road, me falling asleep before I found it. My hands were around something warm. It took a beat before I understood. The key. The tag was the exact green of the trim I remembered. Dull plastic scratched a milk on the edges. The number 12 was inked in the careful hand of someone who still believes in the weight of numbers. The key itself was solid, brass gone soft from years of thumbs. I turned it over in the weak light until the cut of it made me dizzy. My car clock blinked 2:17 at me when I turned the ignition, and it woke like it had only napped. The heater breathed back to life. The wipers dragged a dirty crescent across the glass and smeared my own breath into a ghost. There was grit under me, something like sand. I reached down and touched it without looking and brought up a line of pine needles stuck in a damp pancake of dust and a single flake of white paint. I told myself I dreamed the clerk, that my dumb brain had pasted a tired face onto the shape of sleep. But I could still feel the register's paper under my hand, the way the pen fought me, the clerk's quiet waiting. My stomach rolled like I'd come down too fast from a place that had been higher than I should have gone. I put the car in gear and pulled back onto the Parkway with the sense that I was sliding between the teeth of something that wasn't done chewing. The next 20 minutes were a tunnel. The road, the frost smoke in the trees, my own reflection in the side window refusing to be a stranger. Twice, I reached to put the key on the passenger seat, and twice, my hand didn't want to open. I passed a ranger station a mile or two along and thought about pulling in, about handing the key over and saying something broke between where it was and where it should be. The building was dark. The Coke machine outside mantled in plastic. A paper notice fluttered in a casing I didn't get close enough to read. I kept going. By the time the road dropped into the valley and the first town gathered itself, 2 gas stations facing off, a diner with a sign that tried to believe in breakfast, a motel whose paint had peeled without losing heart, the sky was rinsing pink. I pulled into the diner lot and sat a minute, engine ticking. I could see the motel sign from there, vacancy in a red that made my chest tighten, though it was a different shape than the one in the trees. There were cars in that lot. There were people moving behind the curtains. I turned the key in my hand again and went in for coffee. The waitress had the tired grace of someone whose kindness had learned to pace itself. When I told her I'd just come off the Parkway, she nodded, like the road was a person we both knew. I asked if there was a little motor court up the way with green trim. She shook her head without thinking about it and said no, just the chain hotel near the highway and the one with the peeling paint you could see from where I'd parked. I told her maybe it was farther back toward the state line. She said she'd been here 20 years and nothing green had lasted that long. When I came back out, the key had fogged a little on the metal where my print had warmed it, like the tag had its own breath. I drove to the chain hotel because rest has to happen somewhere. In the daylight, the room felt honest. The plastic smelled like plastic, and the carpet had the same stain every place like it has. I set the key on the nightstand and watched it a while. I don't know what I thought it would do. Roll, warm, whisper, but it just lay there, a small proof. On my way out of town later, fueled and embarrassed by my own need to make sense, I took a detour up a side road that the map in my memory told me would lead back to where the sign had been. The trees yawned apart at a bend and opened onto a patch of gravel that belonged to no one. No building, no pegs with tags, just a ring where tires had turned more times than they needed to and an old bottle browned by winters. I put the car in park and listened. Somewhere out of sight, an ice machine hummed and then, just as quick, did not. I didn't get out. I didn't turn the key over. I eased back to the center line and let the woods have the place. That night, the key slept in my pocket, heavy as a tooth. When I woke, the pocket was empty. and the only proof I'd had was a faint resin smell on my hand, like I'd carried a cut branch too long and set it down someplace I wasn't meant to. Story 12. The Watcher in the Median. I first noticed him in that softened hour when the mountains go the color of old bruises and the guardrails pick up the last light. The time when you start telling yourself a warm kitchen is only a few turns away if you just keep moving. The Parkway rolled and dipped and braided itself between ridgelines, and in one of those long, grassy medians that cut a straight stitch through the curves, he stood there like a fence post that had grown a head. Not near the shoulder, not looking to cross, planted right in the middle, hands at his sides, chin tipped toward the tree line as if the dark between trunks could answer him. I told myself he was a surveyor with a strange way of resting, or a hunter waiting for someone to pick him up, or a scarecrow a bored road crew had set out for a joke. My eyes went back to the lane. When I looked again, he wasn't there. I kept my speed steady, the tires humming that old church note against the pavement, and a mile farther on, in another ribbon of median, there he was, again. Same tilt of the head, same stillness, the posture of a man listening to bad news. I passed him and kept passing him, like the road had looped and I was the only one who didn't feel the seam. The light fell out of the ridges and the windshield began to hold my reflection the way a window does, and every time the grass opened between lanes, there he was, a little closer, then a little farther, then so far back it didn't make sense for how fast I was going. My hands were too tight on the wheel, and the wipers worked a dry windshield out of habit, squeaking at the edge like mice. I rolled the radio knob until a station came through thin and brave, a woman singing about a man who used to stand by her gate and never knocked, and I told myself it was a funny rhyme with what I was seeing, that stories pick you when you're tired. The next median was narrow, the grass shaved down to its scalp, and I watched it for him even though I told myself I wouldn't. He was there. He didn't turn to the car. He looked past me into the black of the trees, and I felt the old mountain thing rise, the silent math you do when you decide if something is your business. I should have kept moving, but a small, mean part of me wanted to break the pattern, to make him be anything but a figure stamped onto the road like a warning sign. At the next turnout, I braked harder than I meant to and swung around, gravel popping like corn under the tires, and eased back to where I thought I'd seen him. The median lay empty, the grass flattened here and there the way deer leave it when they bed down. My headlights ran like white water over the stalks and found nothing but a crumpled brown paper bag and a strip of blue surveyor's tape flittering on a twig. I laughed out loud at myself, not kindly, not convincingly, and pointed the car south again. Somewhere beyond mile marker I'd lost count, the road shouldered up to a bald, where wind had cut the trees low and the sky felt near enough to hold. The world should have opened there, but it didn't. The dark kept its hand over everything, and in the first swipe of my high beams across that open middle, he stood again, dead center, as if he had been poured out of the night exactly where my eyes would have to take him in. This time, his head was not turned toward the trees. He was looking at me, not waving, not stepping back, just letting his gaze land the way a hawk does when it knows you can't help what happens next. I slowed without meaning to, tires ticking over the reflectors, and in the brief second the car glided even with him, his eyes moved. They tracked, calm and certain, as if he were recognizing someone late to a meeting. The road narrowed after the bald, shoulder draining off into ditch and laurel, and the medians thinned to scars of dirt between lanes. I breathed like a person learning to do it and told myself, 2 towns and a river and a hamburger, and it will be funny. The median vanished to nothing, and still, somehow, he found a place to stand. Where there should have been only paint and low weeds, he was there, occupying exactly the amount of space a man takes, not more, not less. I passed him. My own reflection was a chalk mask in the side window, eyes too wide. The next curve laid the world out straight as a stretched rope, and I saw him again, much farther ahead, a dark stitch against the faint grass. The speedometer blurred. Somewhere behind my ribs, an old cupboard door swung and hit against its frame with every bump. I said out loud without meaning to, "I see you," and hated how my voice sounded like someone else was practicing with it. The road pinched down for repairs. One lane, cones asleep in their stripes, machines hulking off to the side like idle cattle, and I eased to the posted 25 because there wasn't room to be wrong. The cones ushered me through a slow S like a funeral, and at the far end where the two lanes married badly back together, he stood in my lane. Not in the median now, not between worlds. In my path, lit up so close he didn't belong to the dark anymore. I hit the brakes hard enough to bring my face toward the glass and leave a taste of metal in my mouth, and the car sagged into its belts, and in the licking freeze of those seconds, the part of me that knows ditch from man from deer asked me to choose. He didn't flinch. He didn't rear or call or raise hands. He only tipped his chin that same small degree toward the tree line, as if to say, "Listen." I felt it before I heard it. A small sound under the engine's tired breathing, a thin whistle the way a bottle sings when wind crosses it. Then the bass of it arrived, slow and rolling, down in the ground. The long groan a slope makes when it is done holding. Gravel ticked somewhere, not mine. A rattle ran the ditch. The trees to my right leaned an inch, as if to make a point. The cones in my headlights trembled like fish against current. I saw the shift in the bank ahead, a dark slide, quiet and sure, earth letting go of where it had been, most of it resting but a sheet of slick clay sliding toward where my bumper would have been if I had not stopped. My hands had gone incapable. I could not have steered if my life asked. The slide eased into the lane like an animal lying down across a doorway. The sound of it stilled. I breathed once, too loud to be safe. When I lifted my eyes, the lane was a throat half blocked, and the man was gone. There was no place for him to have stepped. The cones did not tip. The machines kept their patient watch. High on the slope, a rock let go and tapped its way to rest as gently as a button dropped on a table. I sat and let the heater fog my breath into the glass and listened to the mountain finish talking. After a while, the smell of wet dirt reached me through the vents, clean and mineral and older than I am. I pulled forward 3 feet and backed the car into the sliver of shoulder the cones had left, clicked on my hazards, and waited with my hands flat on my thighs. I tried to put a face to the man and couldn't. I tried to fix the color of his jacket and found only the color of road at night. Headlights finally swam up from behind and eased to a stop. The driver leaned out and asked if I was broke down, and I told him the hill had rolled a little. He peered around me, said, "Huh." Thought I saw somebody waving. I said I hadn't. He nodded like that was reasonable and called the county line from his truck, and we waited together. 2 strangers rocking slightly in the old wind that runs the spine of these mountains. By the time the crew came with lights and shovels and a small loader that moved earth like a careful hand, the cones looked smaller. The men joked the easy way you do when the ground behaves. One of them asked if I'd seen it happen, and I said no, I'd just been made to stop. He looked past me into the median, at nothing, and then at the tree line as if he had heard something too soft for words. When the lane opened again, I drove on. For a few miles more, every time the grass split the road, I kept my eyes forward and named what was ahead, the next bend, the next sign, the next mile, just to have something true to offer the dark. It felt like respect to do that. It still does. I haven't driven that stretch since without checking the medians with the corner of my eye, not to see him exactly, but to leave room for where he might stand if the ground has anything else it needs to say.